Deepa, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to have with me a diverse panel who's looking at this topic of innovation and FinTech in this digital age from many different perspectives. The perspectives of regulators, of small business people, of innovators, of policymakers, and of thinkers. And there is a lot to discuss here because there's something that strikes me about this particular moment, which is really should be a cause for reflection on the part of everybody at this conference. And that is, it almost seems to some extent as if the availability of technology, of connectivity, of data, has outstripped for the moment our ability to really use that fully to deliver new forms of financial services to those who at the moment do not have access to those financial services. So that's going to be one of the themes that we are going to be discussing. But what I'd like everybody to get out of this who's listening is a real sense of how they can practically take forward innovative processes to address real-life practical problems. And we have the people on hand who do that for a living every day. And so let me introduce all of you. I'm first going to be introducing Darlene Menzies. Darlene was named by the World Economic Forum as one of the top 6 female tech entrepreneurs in Africa in 2017. And she has run a number of startups, and at the moment is running a startup called Finfind, which is South Africa's leading online access portal for financial solutions for SMEs. So Darlene is not only a small business person herself, but is an enabler of other SMEs. Then I also want to introduce Nicki Koorbanally, who is the CEO of mLab here in Southern Africa. And mLab is a mobile technology accelerator, which supports new startups in a number of ways, through coding academies, through specialist skills services, but also by facilitating lean innovation. Olaotse Matshane is a 20-year veteran of South Africa's National Treasury and is at the moment the Chief Director for Financial Sector Policy in National Treasury. And she's responsible for a whole host of issues that matter a lot for this conversation: financial inclusion, market conduct and consumer protection, and consumer financial education. And she also looks after a number of cross-cutting areas that's of interest to us: retail credit, insurance, banking, ombud services, and payment services, and even medical schemes and sustainable finance. She's also a member of the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group here in South Africa, which is I always want to say, a collective of policymakers and regulators to create space for FinTech innovation. And also on the same entity is Gerhard van Deventer, who is actually a PACA true regulator with the South African Reserve Bank. He was a founding member of the FinTech unit at the SARB in 2017. He's been part of the bank's virtual currency task team since 2016. So I have many questions for him, also of a speculative nature. And he also serves on the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution here in South Africa. And then finally, for a non-South African perspective, Srinivas Yanamandra is the compliance head at the New Development Bank, which is the bank promoted by BRICS member countries really to provide developmental and infrastructure finance across many countries. And in addition to that, Srinivas is at the moment a visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Srinivas, is that correct? And what he's doing there is to explore what sustainable infrastructure really means and what that means for financial regulation. And that is a quite sort of interesting topic, I think, for all of us in developing countries. And Srinivas, like most of us, all of us seem to have around about 18, 20 years of experience. So we're still young, but we have a few things to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with you, Darlene. And, why I'm starting off with you is because you are at the coalface. Not only are you advising SMEs and providing products for them, but you're also an entrepreneur yourself. And so my first question to you is, really from a customer perspective, you think of small businesses as customers of FinTech and needers of the kind of innovation that we are discussing today. What do SMEs need these days in terms of financial services? What entrepreneurs need and what young people need their financial services providers that they are not getting?
Great. Well, first of all, it's just a wonderful honor and a privilege to be on this panel with the fellow colleagues, and wonderful to be able to speak out into other parts of the world on these very important issues. Now, I think just to say, first of all, Stephan, as you said, I am an entrepreneur. I've actually had 3 businesses that have liquidated over a period of about 16 years. And so early on, I really learned really through the real hard challenges around what does work, what doesn't work. And, when you've got consumers or corporate customers, very often it's much easier to sell to them. When you're selling to an entrepreneur, they're spending, they don't have a lot of money to spend, and what they do have to spend needs to really work for the problem that they're having. So I think just broadly what I'd like to say about any product that you develop for an SME or an entrepreneur or a young person coming into business, but also particularly in the financial services arena, is that it has to be fit for purpose. So I think you have to, I always say products developed by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs are often the best products, because if you've actually had the stone in your shoe yourself and you actually understand the pain and you understand the real challenge of a particular area, then very often you develop the right solution, as opposed to possibly a corporate or government who may have an idea of what they think the problem is, but when they actually deliver it to the customer, it's actually not something that is very easily taken up. You might have a bit of quick acquisition, but then you don't have much retention. The next thing is that it's easy to find. There's some really, really good products out there that nobody knows exist. They're like the best kept secrets. And I think this is a big thing for people in FinTech and innovators developing a product for this particular market. Easy to find, easy to access. They're actually 2 different things, and I'll quickly speak to those. Easy to use is probably paramount. We've got to keep remembering, especially in South Africa, that the majority of our users of our products are probably second language English speakers, people that are not always au fait with using technology. We've just run a survey, the SA SME COVID Impact Survey, using across one of the partners was government and other big businesses like Business Leadership South Africa and the JSE. And we partnered with them to look at what happened over COVID. 58% of entrepreneurs who responded to that survey had never had an online meeting prior to COVID. More than half had never had an online meeting. 59% had never done digital marketing. So it doesn't matter how good your product is, if people don't actually know how to access it or how to see it coming into their particular arena. So solutions that are fit for purpose, easy to find, easy to access, easy to use, and affordable. And I think later on we're going to go into a little bit about the whole broadband discussion, but really affordability, zero-rated products, providing subsidized digital content and access to internet and financial products at no charge. And it's maybe a new model that some of the, not only government, but the MNOs and some of the financial providers need to have a look at if they want to actually access this market. Because once you've accessed the market, you can then sell your products across the market. But if they can't actually even get to your product, then that's a big issue. So education is massive. We had a large number of businesses that responded to our survey that didn't know how to do business online, couldn't market online. So those are some critical areas that need addressing. The other thing I wanted to raise is really this fit for, I want to just hone in as I finish off, and then we can speak about some other things going forward, is the fit for purpose. I look at one of the products in the market that we had a look at was accounting. Every small business owner, every entrepreneur, doesn't matter who you are, you have to do your books. You can't access finance. There's nothing that you can do properly if you can't manage your cash flow. If you can't see where the cash cliff is coming, you're going to fall into it and your business is going to fail. The problem is most small business owners don't understand accounting language. They don't know if the debtor owes them or they owe the debtor. They've never heard of these terminologies. So when you develop an accounting product that says debtors, creditors, journal, those types of things. It's the right product, but it's a bit like culture eats strategy for breakfast there. The culture of the people using it actually don't understand the actual product that is there, the strategy that you have actually sort of decided to use to access the market. So easy to use and in basic and I'm not saying that entrepreneurs are clever people, they're braver than most of us, so I'm not saying that it's to do with the or sort of intelligence or acumen. It's got to do with really just understanding where they are at a point in time. They know how to develop a product, how to sell a product, they know how to provide a service, but a lot of those back-end office opportunities, like accounting and some of those others, are not things that they're familiar with, and we need to deliver it in a way that they can actually consume it, and it's got to be something that they can actually use. And I think the key to innovation, and I think coming into things that Nicki might speak to, innovation is just simply solving a problem for a big market. It's seeing what everyone sees but thinking differently. So when we looked at accounting, we said, well, everyone needs accounting, but looking at it differently and saying, well, how do you create a product that small business can actually understand? I bought this from there for that much. This is what I paid. This is what I paid with. And in the back end, it's doing your debit and credit and creating your trial balance and the whole FinTech, easy front end, complexity in the back end. So again, I think we need to educate entrepreneurs, first of all, what is out there, give them access to information, aggregation on the product so that it's easy, accessibility, availability, ease of use, affordability. I think just to start off with, those are really broadly the things that I think entrepreneurs desperately need. And I think if we use some of those indicators when we were developing products, then we would find more success in taking product to market and get a much bigger uptake and a much stickier product when people start to use them. Thank you. There's more to say, but I just thought broadly to open with that was really what I wanted to share.
Yeah, Darlene, I think that's a great point. What we can explore down the line is how, from all of our perspectives, policymakers, regulators, and also innovators, we can use particularly digital innovation to achieve those four goals. It's a nice framing, certainly for our discussion. What I wanted to ask you though is, you've started this business Finfind, and how does Finfind help with all of that? You are on mute, Darlene.
I think that must have been, it wasn't me, so magic or maybe somebody controlling my hands. So yeah, I think in any market, and you've got somebody who's providing a product and somebody who needs to take up that product. So in the area of funding, you've got the providers of funding and the seekers of funding. In the area of employment, you've got those looking for jobs and those that are providing jobs. So what I've seen in the market, everything is essentially a situation where you've got, someone who needs something and someone who's got something. The problem is how they find each other. So what Finfind does is we're saying we're not actually providing funding. We're not funders. What we do is we take every funder in the market. So whether they're providing debt, equity, or grant funding, whether they're in the public sector or the private sector, if you are in South Africa and you're providing funding, then our team actually has a database that puts all of that information together. So we've got about 390, I think it is, funders, about over 600 products, and every one of them is in a lot of detail, about 72 points of data that speaks to who the funder is, what the product is, what target market they're looking at, who they will fund, won't fund, what their criteria is. And then on the other side, we have the SME coming in, and we ask them, who are they, what are they looking for? And we basically use data-driven algorithms to match. So it's kind of the dating site, the Tinder site of SME lending. Yeah. And when you think about, one of the points that I wanted to bring up later, one of the aggregation is a big data. Who are these customers? So you might have a lot of FinTech innovators out there. They make a good product, but how do they find a customer? So one of the big opportunities is when you're sitting with a big base of small business customers or consumers, there's a partnership opportunity. So I think knowing who the market is very important. But being able to aggregate, and like I said, it's access to information. We want SMEs to go to one place and be able to find out, what do I need to get funding? What don't I have? What are my gaps? Okay, now that I'm ready, who can give it to me? And I think we can do that in many, many other genres of the requirements for SMEs. We just happen to have done it in funding. And why did we do it? Because I struggled to get funding while one of my business failed. Why did we create an accounting product easy to use? Because I didn't know if the debtor owed me or I owed the debtor, but I realized I needed to understand how to do that. So again, had the problem ourselves, developed a product, raised venture capital, scaled it, and then went and partnered with banks and government and other partners. So yeah, that's what we do in funding. We aggregate all lending in one country and give entrepreneurs an opportunity not to spend their time Googling all night trying to find out who are these different products, because they could never do the work of what a data-driven algorithm does in a second. It would take them a month of Sundays to try and do that. So that's really what our innovation is.
And this is free for SME service?
Yeah, it's free for SMEs. So, and we don't only have the matching service, we also have the financial literacy side. So what if I have a bad credit record? What is collateral? What is equity? So we've got a little funding dictionary in there, or really a finance dictionary that very simply, the kind of questions that when people used to ask me in an audience and I used to get embarrassed to answer because I wasn't quite sure, that's the average entrepreneur out there. They're not finance experts. They're not accounting experts. They are experts at the product that they're developing and that they take into market. That's what they're building their team to do. And I think all of us in this room, government, big business, enterprise development programs, our role is to make the opportunity of them doing that business easier. And really, that's what we really are passionate about doing.
So that's a great example of a process of innovation, Nicki. And I want to move to you now and just say, you are a specialist in this magical thing, this almost amorphous, mysterious activity of how one actually brings new ideas to market and formulates those ideas. Darlene said innovation is to solve a problem for a big market. So, Nicki, how do we do that? What's your advice to all of us and to everybody listening in?
Yeah, thanks, Stephan. I think the first thing to say is that this whole notion of the fourth industrial revolution and FinTech, is the new sexy area to be working in. So that on the one hand, and then given this big melting pot of challenges that a country like ours, South Africa, faces, means that, it's just ripe for innovation, because where there are challenges and obstacles, that's where entrepreneurs and innovators are their best. But of course, if we want to, like Darlene mentioned, actually be successful in building solutions, technologies for these markets and getting them, getting them taken up by society, there are a whole range of ingredients that we need in this melting pot. And if I just look, particularly at this whole financial sector, we still have an enormous part of our population that's unbanked. We have an enormous unemployment rate in the country. And so if we're trying to say, how do we get the youth into entrepreneurship and coming up with innovative solutions, etc., they are facing a number of challenges, besides just access to funding, access to mentors, access to, value chains, supply chains in a sense. And so the approach that the mLab likes to take is we really need to take an ecosystem approach, because you need to tackle innovation from a very holistic perspective. Look at who are all of the role players, how do you move down that supply chain, whether it might be initially from the right skills, the right education, but then access to mentors, access to funding. But ultimately, something never becomes an innovation if it's not commercialized. And so you really do need access to the customers. And I'm very passionate about not just doing one aspect when it comes to innovation. We have, if you, for instance, at the mLab, where we are skilling up entrepreneurs, how to digitize, how to build apps, etc., you then entice them into this whole world of entrepreneurship. I mean, if every South African doesn't have a side hustle, you're really living on a very risky space in these days. And so how do you start up that side hustle? But how do we convert that side hustle into a sophisticated, tangible business that can scale as well, you know? And the way we also do that is to say, well, actually, how do we de-risk getting corporates, for instance, to actually work with small business? How do we entice corporates to open up their supply chains to these new high-risk entrepreneurs, but work with institutions like business incubators, accelerators, etc., to almost broker those relationships? So you can see there's even a relationship management component that's also needed in innovation. And if I just look, you know, in particular at the FinTech space as well, I was quite interested. I read, I think it's a Rand Merchant Bank study that was done. If we look at, you know, all these new FinTech startups in South Africa, it comes from innovators that are in mid to late 30s, have worked in the financial services sector, you know, so it's a more sort of formal kind of education that they've been through, etc. But I think where the real opportunity lies for South Africa is in this huge informal economy, where we're working with grassroots innovators, trying to stimulate youth entrepreneurship. How do we open up this whole complexity of FinTech and regulations and limited peer-to-peer funding, demystify the whole notion around banking services and the banks are out there to get your money, you know? I mean, if we just look at stokvels and how those work, and it's about working with trusted partners. So we have to really look at the ecosystem in which we work. How do we bridge and integrate the informal with the formal? How do we demystify? How do we, like Darlene also mentioned, create easy access and understanding of these new technologies, FinTech services, etc., for these grassroots innovators? And perhaps just my concluding remark, I'd like to say, you know, I just looked at this year with the COVID-19 pandemic, and if you just look at the whole targeted approach around calls for solutions for COVID-19, you know, it was about PPE and, you know, new testing kits, etc. And it really just stimulated so much of activity in a very targeted way. And so I would really love, you know, whether it's through the Reserve Bank or the regulators, how do we open up this whole world of FinTech innovation to those who wouldn't ordinarily access it, or like Darlene mentioned, be too fearful about even treading in that space because you just don't know, or you're too scared, or it just seems too risky. And so I would really love this targeted approach at putting out FinTech challenges to stimulate entrepreneurship, building this vibrant FinTech ecosystem in South Africa, and really opening it up to those who wouldn't ordinarily tap into the space.
Nicki, you mentioned two types of entrepreneurs and innovators that are very different. The one might be the young person who maybe grew up in a township, you know, is incredibly energetic, has some smart ideas, but has very little social capital to work with to complement all that personal capital, let alone financial capital, which is, of course, where Darlene comes in. And then you mentioned the other type of innovator who might have worked for an investment bank or for a big finance house and knows all about payment systems and now has some smart idea. And they have, you know, gobs of social capital, but they still need help because they're still doing something risky. Now, I think most developing countries need both types, I would think, of innovators. Now, mLab is on which one is mLab focusing, and how do you adjust your services accordingly?
Yeah. So, you know, I suppose in a sense, mLab is trying to focus on the very early stage entrepreneur. You might even want to call it's a business founder in a sense. You're not even sure that you're actually an entrepreneur. But given the huge unemployment rate in the country, mLab almost feels like the niche that we can target is a very early stage business founder, really introduce them into the world of entrepreneurship, but it takes a lot of hand holding. So skilling up, as well as what does it take to start a business, and assess really, is this somebody who does have the grit and the thick skin to deal with starting a business. And then mentorship is key. We've just found that if you are able to link one of these grassroots rural township-based entrepreneurs with a mentor who can give them access to networks, help bring them through the ranks. I mean, we've had township-based entrepreneurs who are winning Google Impact challenges and traveling to Finland. So it's not to say that coming from a rural community, you can't have a high-tech, globally scalable solution. It's just about what kind of help you need. And I would love to see us almost linking up, let's say, the other side, where entrepreneurs have had the opportunity to work in corporate, are a lot more experienced, but to almost sort of marry the two, because that's where I believe this whole enriching experience of bringing the two worlds together, it's that niche that they will tackle that for me could mean the difference between who's competitive, grows and scales, because they're able to tackle these new developing emerging markets and untapped markets where big business probably finds too risky to actually tap into. So
no doubt, if you can bring the world of the informal and the formal together, you're doing something very powerful.
Absolutely.
Well, I would say you, as a National Treasury Chief Director, also have to think about both of those worlds. What I want to ask you is when you think about the promise of digital, the promise of financial inclusion, and the promise of FinTech, how do you think it's going? Have the problems been solved? Can you now stand back and let the market sort it all out? What's your sense of how well things are going from an overall level of whether society is really benefiting from FinTech in particular, and how that can be accelerated?
Thanks for that, Stephan, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone across the world. Thank you very much for that question. The promise of FinTech and financial inclusion, I think we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more that needs to be done. I'll just throw in some figures, Stephan, to say 1.7 billion people in the world are unbanked, according to FinTech. 350 million people unbanked in sub-Saharan Africa. In South Africa, we are talking about at least 7.7 million people that are still unbanked. But I think let's understand that this has quite been a journey. 20 years ago, all we needed to do was get low-income people a simple, basic transactional banking account. And we were talking about banking the unbanked. And the space has really evolved where now that everybody, almost 80% of adults have got a bank account, now the focus became usage, where people have got a bank account, but they are not using it, to say, how then do we get usage up? Whilst we are still now tackling the issues of usage, we are then saying, but financial inclusion cannot be just access to a transactional banking account. It has to be the whole universe of financial services. Access to insurance, access to savings and investment, access to responsible credit, access to remittances, And I think for us, financial inclusion has done a lot. If you look at the FinTech space, a lot of FinTechs has played really in the payment space. And I think a lot of work has been done there. If you look particularly in the SMME space that Darlene has spoken a lot about, a lot of FinTechs have really done well in terms of lending, in terms of payments, in terms of insurance. But I think a lot more still needs to be done. And I think where the challenge is is that, a few years ago, Stephan, we used to talk about two economies, the first and the second economy. And I think the reality now is we've got three economies, first, second, and third economy. And depending on where you are, FinTech has probably served you to some extent. If you are in a rural area, you have so many challenges that FinTech is, solutions for FinTech are so far-fetched that, it's something that it's a long road. But I just want to go back to the issue of SMMEs, as it seems is the focus for us. If you look at the SMME landscape, you've got small, you've got medium, you've got micro. And I think a lot of the solutions, I liked Darlene talking about the stone in the shoe. A lot of the solutions have helped your small and medium enterprises. However, I think in the micro space, there's still lots to be done. In the informal space, there's still lots to be done. In the rural space, there's still lots to be done. So I think when we move on the FinTech journey, I think if we can focus on the low income, if we can focus on the rural, on the macro, on the informal, then I think we will be moving into the right direction, Stephan. And also just to mention, look, FinTech and digital technology alone is enough to solve the financial inclusion problem. And as Nicki has introduced the concept of an ecosystem, there's this ecosystem that needs to work together in support of financial inclusion. The paper that you mentioned, Nicki, by R&B, has got this FinTech ecosystem of players. It's got government, it's got incubators, accelerators, entrepreneurs, investors. And government is just a component of that ecosystem. And within the government, we've got our own ecosystem to say, if we want to boost financial inclusion, what do we need to do? So, for example, in the National Treasury space, Stephan, we worry about issues of market conduct. We worry about consumers protected. We worry about, of course, financial stability. Gerhard's colleagues in the Black Building worry about financial stability. We worry about consumer financial education. But then also, National Treasury alone cannot solve all the problems. There's the digital economy, there's digital infrastructure. We've spoken about the low income, we've spoken about rural, we've spoken about informal. Now, digital economy comes with its own challenges in that it can increase actually the exclusion to say, if you are poor, if you are in a rural area and you are informal, you are out of the loop. So I think we need to bring in issues of digital infrastructure. How do we bring in the people? Issues of digital literacy. I mean, as it is, we are just struggling to get it right in terms of financial literacy. Now the world has already moved on talking about digital financial and digital literacy. We are talking about financial inclusion. The world is already talking about digital financial inclusion, So there's lots of challenges that as policymakers, we need to pause. We need to look at the holistic picture. We need to look at the bigger picture. Is the economy, do we have financial stability in terms of the economy? Are consumers protected? How do we let in new players? And how do we create a level playing field for everyone? How do we start to talk about issues of competition? We've got the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition and the Competition Commission. They are also looking at competition in the digital economy. We need to tap into them in terms of this ecosystem that we're talking about. There's issues of cyber security, issues of data protection. People, I think between Nicki and Darlene, they spoke about the issue of data. The issue of data has become huge, and data has become very important, Stephan. And as policymakers, for example, if we look at issues of data, we need to find a balance. Yes, we are talking about data protection, but again, on the other side, how do we allow access to data so that people who don't have access to financial services, that data can be used for the creation of new products and new services? So this is an exciting space, Stephan. I think for now, let me stop there. There's a lot more that I could say, but yeah, for now, let me stop there. Thank you.
That's really fantastic tour of Horizon, Olaotse, and also a sense of what's in the head of all the many things that need to be in the head of a policymaker. I just want to ask you one follow-up question before then going on to the man from the black building, Gerhard. And that question is, we have participants from all over the world on this call. What do you think has been the biggest success in the FinTech or FinTech-related policy space in South Africa for the last decade? Something that would be interesting for other people to hear about and for all of us on this call to build on.
I think without a doubt, Stephan, is the creation of the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group that Gerhard and I are part of, where it created the Innovation Hub. The Innovation Hub has got three components: the Regulatory Guidance Unit, the Sandbox, which is most exciting, and the Innovation Accelerator. So firstly, it was the first in South Africa that all the financial regulators coming together in one room to say we are going to work together. And National Treasury, of course, we are a policymaker. Some people think that we are a regulator. But on the IFWG, we've got the Competition Commission, we've got SARS, we've got the IFC, we've got the FSCA, the Prudential Authority, we've got the SAB. So for me, I think that's the biggest success so far in that space, Stephan, because as policymakers, we tend to be slow in terms of reacting to what is happening out there in the innovation space. So things like the Sandbox has given us an opportunity for the sector to come and say, I've got an idea that I need to test out. The current regulatory and legislative landscape doesn't allow me to do what I want to do. You can then go into the Sandbox and test your idea in a safe space. So I think by far the creation of the IFWG and the work that is happening there has been fantastic.
Well, you've now just also taken over my job of introducing Gerhard, because this is a perfect segue to you, Gerhard, to say, so what's going on there with the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group? What exactly does the Innovation Hub do? How does the Sandbox work? Olaotse gave you this sterling testimonial. Is it as good as it sounds? What can we take from it? Perhaps just for other people listening in who are not South African. So if I understand correctly, this group involves, the credit regulator, the capital markets regulator, the banking regulator, levels of both conduct and prudential supervision, and it contains the policymakers as well as the cross-cutting regulators, for example, for competition. We have a competition authority here called the Competition Commission. So that's what it is. Gerhard, give us an inside view as to what's going on in the Sandbox and beyond.
Thanks, Stephan. So I was going to say that, after all I did to say that setup, I probably wouldn't have anything to say. But let me go through it very quickly. So as you rightly highlighted and as pointed out by Ola, there's 6 regulators and the policymakers, so 7 entities currently making the Intergovernmental FinTech Working Group. We were established in 2016 between 4 regulators. I think I might just have lost sound there a little bit quickly. But between 3 regulators and Treasury initially in 2016, and then grew to now include SARS, the National Credit Regulator, and SARS obviously being the tax regulator in South Africa, and the Competition Commission. So we have these 3 structures as indicated. And the Innovation Accelerator, and I think I always say, there's 3 things in life: that's certain, death, taxes, and definitions, confusion by definitions. So that's a little bit different to an incubator, the way that I would maybe define mLab, but the Innovation Accelerator has 2 kind of different approaches. But, and I think it's for us to, the overall kind of theme within the Innovation Hub is responsible innovation. From an Innovation Accelerator perspective, we look at it from 2 angles. So the one is by looking at the technology, but it's never just looking at the technology for the sake of looking at technology. If we look at, for instance, Project Korka, it's playing with distributed ledger technology to understand the implications for financial market regulation. We want to take that forward and issue debentures on blockchain, and again to look at the policy and regulatory implications as it impacts on regulated entities. So as policymakers and regulators, always ties back to that. The second angle in the innovation accelerator is to look at it, starting by looking at it from a policy and regulatory perspective, and to see how the different innovations impacts on that. And so that's something like the Crypto Asset Regulatory Working Group, where Ola also contributes on. So looking to create a regulatory framework for crypto assets, as an example. There's currently 8 initiatives in there. So some of the stuff that we'll look at in more detail next year includes big tech. So kind of Google and those companies, the work that they're doing in South Africa, whether and how some of those things should be regulated. Under that definition, also telcos in South Africa, looking at them increasingly providing services, looking at things like SupTech, so supervisory technology, how we use technology to regulate better, and a few other things. So I won't carry on there too much. The regulatory guidance unit, so Nicki asked, in some of the different, maybe let me highlight, so just thinking about some of the things that Nicki said. We participated last year, again, as part of the FinTech Festival. We ran an accelerator, so again, it's not an incubator, but we ran a competition for local fintechs in South Africa. To the 2 local winners at that stage were able to go to the Singapore FinTech Festival in Singapore and present on a national stage. So I know, I think other organizations like CEDA, so the Small Enterprise Development Agency, TIA, and then the broader ecosystem, like mLab, are doing great work. I maybe just want to give a shout out to Darlene as well. I think in thinking about the innovation ecosystem, the report by Finfind in terms of funding challenges for small and growing enterprises or SMEs, whatever hashtag we want to use, it gives really great insights into that environment. But moving on to the regulatory guidance unit, so the second structure within the Innovation Hub, that in essence, and I know some people will get a heart attack when I say this, but conceptually, for me, it's a call center. So if you're an innovator in South Africa and you're wondering about where you fit within the legislative or the regulatory framework, it's one point of contact that provides you or puts you in contact with all those regulators that you mentioned, Stephan. And we can kind of provide, we're not providing legal guidance, but we're providing an informal steer in terms of where you fit within the regulatory framework. I know the stats came out again for up till November yesterday, but I apologize, I haven't looked at it yet. But up until the end of October, we've engaged with 74 innovators in South Africa. That is fintechs as well as incumbents also approach us to ask us about different things. And so that's the regulatory guidance unit. We try and respond to your questions. If it's a frequently asked type question, we try and respond within 5 days, but for some of the other questions, we need to engage and have meetings. We try to respond quicker than that. Then Ola also mentioned the Regulatory Sandbox. So that was announced in April. We went live. It's taken us, so you're asking about is everything as wonderful? That has taken us a little bit longer than anticipated, I think. Trying to traverse the regulatory framework and trying to figure out where we can allow exceptions to laws. It's taken us a bit longer than anticipated. But we got 50, very excited. We got, one stage we launched shortly after COVID, and we were wondering whether we're going to get any responses at all. And in fact, another part of the problem is that we were overwhelmed. We received 52 applications, and taking those through the process. Currently, the shortlist is at 12. 1 or 2 of them might still drop, but we are allowing them to enter the sandbox as they are ready to test. So one firm is currently testing, another will go live soon to test. We're hoping that probably by the end of January, everybody that's left on that shortlist will have gone live. Maybe just want to touch on something that you said a little bit earlier. You called me a proper regulator, and I think for me,
you're an improper regulator.
I'm very improper. You're right, Stephan. So I started out as a developer working at a small firm. Later moved over, so I think I understand to some extent what a small firm kind of trying to survive is about. I moved over to IT audit later on, and so I think I understand kind of the risk elements of proper governance and things like that. As well, moved to the SARB in about 2013 as part of a small team responsible for IT risk regulation. And so I'll maybe say a few things before I pause. But it was interesting. I was listening to a FinTech the other day talking about their journey, and I think they started out by saying, thanks to this guidance note ABC. And I was like, hey, I actually, I was responsible for drafting that. And so there's this company that kind of, is able to exist because of something that I did. So, or at least that I was involved in. So, on the one hand, I feel like, being a regulator and a policymaker puts us in a very responsible position where, what we do affects the market. So, for in terms of mandate, the SARB is responsible for price and financial stability, but they are that within the context of sustained economic growth. And I think, although some of the things aren't necessarily our primary mandate, I think if we can contribute to that, through that hashtag of responsible innovation, that's great. But that, of course, go on to say, it's taken us a long time because we had to get audit reports and things like that. So then you go like, but again, it's responsible innovation. So
I think that's a very good slogan. I think for this call, but also for the improper regulators of the world and the very proper policy makers of the world, like Olaotse, to promote. As Srinivas, you have extensive experience across a whole host of international settings, not least of which is in the context of infrastructure. And so far, this discussion has been very South Africa focused, although it has some universal lessons that are interesting. I'll come back to those later on. And it's been focused quite a lot on the needs of businesses. But when one thinks about infrastructure financing, that's important, A, because infrastructure matters, but also because we need a lot of infrastructure financing to connect everybody up to the digital age. What's your sense of what really matters when you look at infrastructure financing going into the future? And what role does digital play, both as a recipient of that funding, but also as a facilitator of that funding?
Thanks, Stephan, and glad to meet all colleagues here from South Africa. And even before I start my brief inputs, I would like to say that even I'm a big fan of the South African Reserve Bank's the interregulatory working group. I have been following the development since last 2 years, and it is my privilege to know a lot of activities that they're doing in the crypto space and also regulatory innovation. And myself have been a very fan of the FOCA that they have put in place, and I try to share some learnings from the South African Reserve Bank to other BRICS countries. So to that extent, I would like to place on the kind of good work that the African Reserve Bank is doing, and there is a lot of learning from the world out there. And coming straight to the point in terms of infrastructure and the connection to the digital technology, I think I need to make a reference to what Darlene has mentioned. Basically, the infrastructure, when we talk about, has to extend to 2 steps beyond what the payment infrastructure is. Because while the digital technology primarily is focused in terms of the payment infrastructure, what really makes a value to the end a small unit or a small firm is basically how it is going to facilitate not only their payment-related activities, but a broad array of their supply chain activities, their accounting activities, for instance. So that will make the life a lot easy for the firms. So to that extent, when we talk about infrastructure, while the core focus could be on payment, but there should be an additional and ancillary focus on the surrounding activities that have got the firm's ease and also the ease of doing business at its periphery as well. And to that extent, I think I completely agree with Gerhard in terms of how this innovation has to be made responsive. But to do all these things, the push has to to come not only in the periphery activities, but on the core payment infrastructure development. So to that extent, I would like to say that there are three important components of developing this payment infrastructure. One is the infrastructure development funds, because most of these infrastructures are not necessarily be created in a private space and totally not created by the public sector financing. So it could be a kind of a seed financing that the governments have to initially lay down, and that seed financing should have got different kinds of a model in which the industry participates and takes a kind of benefit out of it, but also has a kind of skin in the game into the total infrastructure development of the country. In the context of the payment infrastructure development, I would like to cite an experiment what Reserve Bank of India has done. It has started a seed capital of like 250 crores by the Reserve Bank of India, and made all the card issuing banks and card networking banks as a kind of participants, so that this entire infrastructure that is getting created is for the benefit of everyone, but also is contributed by everyone. So the first aspect of developing that infrastructure is again to make sure that there is a kind of a seed fund which is like available for the purpose of mobilizing the private sector fund. So the seed fund contribution becomes the key from the public sector perspective. And then the second aspect is in terms of the after the infrastructure development. The second thing is in terms of the payment innovation, the innovation hubs. This is where I would agree with Gerhard in terms of the role the policy would make, and especially the regulatory sandboxes that will get created. Here it is very important to note that the sandboxes currently have got a little bit of, I think, a narrow focus in terms of sectoral focus in countries. Most of the countries, either they have got sandboxes created by insurance authorities, or sandboxes created by banking authorities, or sandboxes created at a city or a provincial level. But what is more important, I think this is where the South African experiment is a kind of a learning for other, what you call regulators to follow, because this is at one place where all regulators come together, and not only the regulators in the financial services industry, but even the competition authorities, if they come into the picture. So that is when there is a kind of an unified policy with respect to the innovation that can be created. So that is one important aspect, the regulatory unification and the direction that it can give to the payment innovation efforts. That's an important point. And also, sitting from the place where I am, like operating from a multilateral development perspective, there are the ways in which the developmental banks also can play in terms of their private capital and their private sector financing into these kind of regulatory initiatives. The one example that I could of late see and try to learn from is basically how the International Financial Corporation has partnered with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and they have created a regulatory sandbox for ASEAN countries. So the way the regulatory sandbox at a regional level works is basically the IFC will nurture with the help of the MAS a kind of an ecosystem in which the ASEAN country fintech firms can participate in a kind of innovative proposals, to which the funding part of it can be guaranteed to a large extent by the IFC, and there could be a kind of a seed investments and as a kind of a venture capital, but from a developmental focus can be done. So that makes a kind of a regulatory sandbox geared up even to a regional and with a support of a developmental financial institution makes a lot of difference. And again, to make sure that it is all taken with all its seriousness, we have a unified regulator like a MAS trying to work with this entire setup right from the beginning. So once we have the infrastructure development focus from the public sector, then there is an innovation focus, and that innovation focus with a unified regulator and then at a regional regulator with the support of the developmental financial institution makes the key. And the third and most important concept is...
Sorry to interrupt you. I think you said there were three legs. The one is the Infrastructure Development Fund, then the Innovation Hubs.
Innovation Hub.
Linked to the Sandbox. And which is the third?
The third one is what I'm saying is about the interoperability, the payment interoperability.
Okay.
So it is most important thing is that whenever we are creating these kind of innovative initiatives, it is important for us that we will not stuck up into a kind of friction to the consumers at the end. So it is important for us to make sure that the policies are in such a way laid down that the interoperability between the firms, so that the switchover costs to the customers are very negligible, and also for the firms it doesn't create any kind of incentives for getting into monopolies. So that is
I hear what you're saying. And that links back to, so thank you very much for that perspective, which I think ties together a number of new angles and new necessities. And it also, of course, links into the importance of the competition authorities participating in these processes. We only have a few minutes left for sort of general discussion. I think it's been so interesting. So I think it's been time well spent to have all of you really articulate what you care about most. But for these few remaining minutes, what really strikes me is the power of this notion of ecosystem, which all of you have used in a different way. And I think to the extent that there's a South African example, which is really fascinating, it's that within government, there's an ecosystem of regulators and policymakers that's working and being coordinated. But the point really that Nicki particularly made is that in order to help smaller firms and other users of FinTech, you actually need to think about a larger ecosystem. And Srinivas pointed from a non-South African perspective to what that could look like and what has worked in India. So what I want to ask all of you, and I'll go around the table, so to speak, in the 5 minutes that we have remaining, is when you look at this need for a well-functioning ecosystem, in your perspective, so in 4 of these cases will be a South African one and then Srinivas, what's the biggest struggle? What's the thing that's the most difficult, that's stopping the most things from happening, or is the most difficult to get right? And I'm going to give each of you a minute just to say, this is the most difficult thing, this is what we should be working on for the next 2 years. Starting with, same order, Darlene. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm on mute.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, thanks. 1 minute. Yeah, thanks for that. I think, just to say this, the ecosystem, it sounds very obvious, needs to include the entrepreneur. I so often find the public sector and the private sector, first of all, they struggle to find each other. So government wants to work with big business, but doesn't know how to approach business. Big business doesn't. But when they do find each other and they're developing this ecosystem for the entrepreneur, you'd be very, very hard pressed to find the entrepreneur in any of those conversations with a real voice.
I'm going to cut you off. But in a way that you will approve of. And so we will ask our 2 FinTech working group members when they are going to allow some entrepreneurs onto their working group.
I just want to say this quickly. It mustn't be a tick box exercise. It must be a very real, they must have a real voice with where they can actually bring something meaningful to the table. Otherwise, you're going to develop something that no one can use.
I hear you, but I want to give Nicki, Nicki, you've got 30 seconds to say, what should we focus on? What's missing? What's the gap?
Yeah, I think similar to, the thread that Darlene has started, collaboration is the new innovation. We have to break down the silos. Let's not feel vulnerable about exposing ourselves. And I indeed was going to say, when we come up with new regulations, when we have these working groups, we have to involve the entrepreneurs in there. So we have to work as a collective. We need to collaborate more.
Okay, but I'm going to leave Olaotse off the hook purposefully, because I'm actually very interested, Olaotse, in your sort of more general view. So we know you'll look after the entrepreneurs. Your more general view of what should we focus on as a country, and what do you think would be interesting also for other countries to hear?
Yeah, I think it's a bit difficult, Stephan. There are so many things, but if I was to choose one, it's access to digital infrastructure, because we come up with all these wonderful FinTech solutions, but if somebody in some rural area somewhere doesn't have a cell phone with connectivity, with affordable data, then we can just forget about it. So access to digital infrastructure has to be my number one. Then we can plug in all the other solutions.
Yeah, never has a truer word been spoken. Gerhard?
So maybe three things from my side very quickly. So I think it can definitely be done. Yeah, can definitely be done better, but we do involve the innovators in the space. So, for instance, on the crypto asset regulatory working group, Ola had the opportunity, particularly with to interrogate some of the exchanges like Luno in terms of some of their value offerings, and so they definitely provide input. I think the second thing is that we can connect better as a framework, including with other government organizations. And then the third thing, just to kind of also bring a different angle, I think there's a need for foresight and anticipatory governance. It's oftentimes very difficult to change laws. And I think it's, one thing to draw up regulation, but also, you have to get it through government. So I don't have an answer on that one yet, but if I can highlight
those are two. I've given you 2 out of your 3. But now I just want to give Srinivas, who can actually solve Olaotse's problem with digital access for us. What's the big gap, Srinivas, from your perspective?
No, I think the biggest thing that is going to happen is the financial economy is going to convert it into a data economy once this digital technology comes into picture. So the way we look at data and the way we are going to trade the data, so the kind of innovations that have seen in the past with respect to money, I think that needs to be done with respect to the data. So you need to have more data exchanges. You need to have more pricing models for the purpose of the data so that the users get the kind of the value for the data that they provide. So we need to really create a kind of a new way of looking at the utility of the data, the localization of the data, the price of the data, and the control and the custody of the data, because what is going to be critical in this economy is how you're going to have a complete control and custody of this data for all the stakeholders concerned, and it is not like in the hands of a very few people. So for me, the data-oriented perspective is going to be the key on which everything else can be built upon, because that would be the key objective for everything else that we are talking about here.
No, thank you. I think that's a very useful pointer to the future. Then just from my side, to thank all of you for what I think has been an excellent, excellent session and so many interesting ideas. But what I loved most about it is that it comes back into a sense that, there's no better government than a joined-up government. And the FinTech working group is such a great example of it. And I think we are all proud of the work that the working group is doing, and we're all learning from it. But there's no better society than a joined-up society. So what Nicki is doing, what Darlene is doing, it's those interconnections in the private sector, in the public sector, and across the two that will solve these problems, as long as we are practical. And I'm very fortunate that I had a panel of 5 very practical people today. So I want to thank all of you. Also thank the Singapore Festival for this opportunity. And I hope for everybody who listened in and watched that it was interesting and above all stimulating. So thank you very much.